Good morning and welcome to today's forum. We are talking about getting your organization organized, the value of information management. We're happy to welcome Sam Meister today. He's a consultant helping individuals and organizations plan, strategize, and take action around how to protect their data. For over 10 years, he's worked with libraries, archives, museums, and other nonprofits to build sustainable workflows and archival programs. He's also helped them ensure long-term access to their valuable information. He's taught workshops on managing digital content, electronic records, and digital preservation for the Society of American Archivists and the Library of Congress. Sam holds a master's degree of Library and Information Science from San Jose University and a Bachelor's of Arts from University of California, San Diego. Before I turn the mic over to Sam this morning, we're going to cover our usual housekeeping. This webinar is being recorded, which means that you will have access to it after the webinar is over. It will be emailed to you using the email address that you registered in with Eventbrite. You won't be visible as the attendee, you won't be visible, but the panelists will be visible. So you'll be able to get the content that way. If you are interested in closed captioning, please take a look at the bottom black bar at the bottom of your screen. On the right-hand side, you'll see 3 dots that say more. If you click on that, you'll see show subtitles. And when you click there, the subtitles will appear on your screen. You can click and drag them around your screen as you need to. You can also change the size of your subtitles in subtitle settings in that same menu. After this forum is over, please keep an eye on your inbox. You'll receive an email there that has a link to the video recording to this. It also will have a survey that asks how we've done today, how did you enjoy the forum, and what other types of forums would you like to see here. And it'll also have a copy of the slides of this presentation today. Finally, we are using the chat box today for technical related questions and the Q&A box for content related questions. So if you have a question for Sam at any point during this presentation, feel free to plop those questions in the Q&A box. I'll be keeping an eye on content questions in that Q&A box, and during the Q&A section, we will review them. If you see a question there that you want to hear more about, please go ahead and upvote that question. That helps me know how to prioritize the questions in that box. And with that, I'm happy to turn it over to Sam.
Thanks so much, Danielle, and thanks to the Columbus Foundation for the opportunity to be here today and to participate as a speaker in the Nonprofit Forum series. And thanks to all of you who are able to join today and learn more about the value of information management in nonprofit organizations. I'm very passionate about this topic, in part because I think it's one that impacts everyone, but is not something that people always think about very often. So I hope one of my primary goals is that I can impart some of my passion to you today, and that the issues, the ideas, and the strategies we will cover will resonate with you. And you'll see how they're relevant to the work that you're doing in your organizations. So information management may seem like a pretty broad topic. So what I've attempted to do here is start at the beginning and provide some foundation and framing for why and how a strategic approach to information management could be useful and beneficial, particularly for nonprofit organizations. And I'm really so grateful to Danielle for our discussions and her feedback as I work to refine the focus of this talk, which I think and I hope you will find complementary to other recent forum topics, including ones on IT security awareness and nonprofit finance basics. There's definitely some helpful overlap, I think, in a lot of the issues. So in putting together this talk, I've drawn from my experience of working with organizations of various types and sizes with an intention of providing a practical approach to first sort of thinking about and then starting to implement information management in nonprofit organizations. So that's sort of my intro, and then I'll I'll share my screen now. Okay. So here are my goals for the presentation today. First, I'm going to illustrate some of the common challenges to information, and some of these will likely seem very familiar to you already. Next, I'll talk through why information has different kinds of value. This may seem obvious, but hopefully looking at an example will make it a little more, make it less abstract. And then I'll go over some of the benefits, right, of information management in organizations. And finally, I'll end by talking through some of the initial steps that can be taken to start implementing information management in your organization. So let's get started by considering, right, some of the inherent challenges, right, that come with the volume, the scale, and the complexity of information, right, in any kind of organization these days. So whether in our personal lives or our professional lives, right, we're surrounded, right, by an ever-growing volume and scale of information, and navigating, right, sort of moving through this increasing volume is a significant challenge. It can really seem overwhelming, right, and difficult to know where to begin. I think, you know, the email inbox is likely the easiest example to invoke here. I mean, how many of you have hundreds of unread emails sitting in your inbox, right, that you just haven't sort of come around to dealing with? And how many of those might actually be sort of important and worth keeping? Second, right, information can be messy, and perhaps some of the following kinds of scenarios are familiar. You know, there's a closet full of random boxes and papers somewhere in the office, or the digital version, right? There's some random lists of folders and files and SharePoint that people are not sure what they are and what's in there. That time, perhaps when you were trying to find some information, maybe photos, right, from a recent member appreciation event, or, you know, something you want to put out in a publication, but you don't know where it is, don't know where to start looking for it. And if you haven't, right, experienced these specific scenarios before, it's likely you're going to, right, at some point in the future. It's just very easy for information assets to get, right, sort of shoved into random folders, or even, you know, automatically saved, right, to locations you're not sure where they are on your local device, right? Particularly if you're downloading something from the internet. So this makes searching for, right, and finding needed information later on much more difficult. And also, when information is disorganized, it's harder to know, you know, what you have and if it's actually still needed, and what information, you know, could potentially be removed or deleted, right, because it's not necessary anymore. Another big challenge, right, to finding information is that it's often embedded, stored, sort of located in multiple places, right? And this can make it hard to extract, sort of get the information out and gather it together and analyze it in different ways, or sort of edit it and compile it and potentially even share it, right, in different ways. So information might be in specific types of documents, right, like annual reports or financial reports or other kinds of documents. It might be sort of as data, or it's structured data in databases, like a donor database or a CRM or other kinds of databases. And it's likely a lot of valuable information is in conversations and exchanges via email, right? In the email text itself, or as attachments. There's a lot that ends up getting absorbed into email, or something even like text messages, right? Or other kinds of messaging communication tools where, you know, ideas are being generated and shared and decisions are being made. But information also exists, right, in people's heads. You might call this institutional knowledge or institutional memory. And it's right, it's not necessarily a bad thing that individuals have deep knowledge, right, about an organization's history, about its practices, operations, relationships. But this scenario can start to be problematic if the valuable information that multiple people need access to is only known by one or two individuals. If the information about the processes or sort of how things work at an organization isn't documented right, then it can be difficult to maintain that as things change over time, and then share that with others. And that's right, especially true in situations of leadership transition, organization structure changes, etc. I'm going to go through a series of other kinds of challenges as well, particularly related to digital information, right? And I really want to sort of debunk or sort of hopefully get you to think differently about the idea that digital information is just going to be around forever. It may be the case, right, that your organization has paper documents and files, right, that have been created and are still being created and stored in physical drawers and cabinets, right? That is often still the case, or it's sort of a hybrid environment. But for the most part, we are doing the work of creating, drafting, editing, analyzing, sharing information with digital tools and systems, right, and services. And the outputs of these processes are primarily digital, right? By default, they get stored on our computer hard drives, servers, or right in the cloud, right? Which really is just, actual data centers, right? Sort of around the world. And most folks have a sense that digital information is going to last a long time, right? If not forever. It will continue to be available if we need it, so we don't need to think about it very much. And while it's true that standard IT practices, they really do a great job of making sure that sort of system-wide information is backed up, right, on a regular basis. So if needed, right, it's possible to retrieve files. But there are many types of risks that can lead to damage, corruption, or even complete loss of valuable digital information, especially for the kinds of information that you want to keep going forward, right, for the foreseeable future. So starting with media obsolescence, right, and what that just means is that when storage media becomes obsolete, right? So for those of us that remember and used floppy disks or CD-ROMs, or even increasingly USB drives, those media themselves and the hardware needed to open up and sort of get data or open up data on those media are increasingly not available, right? Not part of our contemporary devices, so it's hard to get to that data. So it's just the obsolescence of sort of trapping data on certain devices. There's also the issue of just media failing, right? It tends to have a reasonably short lifespan. Hard disks usually are around for about 5 years, and then the failures start to occur toward the end of those lifespan, causing something like bit rot, right, which can cause corruption of individual files or everything on a disk. And sure, in the case of using cloud services, right, a lot of that's being managed in a data center, so maybe that's not as much of a concern. But if you do have the case that you have some portable or external hard drives that you use for specific reasons, and the only copy of the data, right, is on that drive, then that's a risk that that drive just may not work anymore, and that data will be very difficult and expensive to retrieve, and not all of it may be possible to retrieve. There's also the case of just the file formats themselves. So even if the media is okay and you can get to the files, older files, right, can tend to be obsolete, particularly if they're needed, if you need particular specialized kinds of software, or they're proprietary, right, they're not sort of openly available. The file formats make it challenging to even open up those files again in sort of a contemporary software environment and get access to the information. It's also the case of right? Inappropriate, right? Or malicious access, right? When data or digital files are accessed with the specific intention, right, of causing harm or damage. And that's, right, an increasing threat in all kinds of organizations. And this is where I would definitely point to the recent forum topic on IT security awareness, because that speaker does a really great job of going into the sort of range of subtopics and threats, and then strategies for how to deal with them. So I'll just mark that as an issue to learn more about that topic. There's also the case of just human error, right? Unintentional or accidental access can result in damage or corruption or loss, right? People who just maybe don't need to have access, but it's available and they just accidentally delete something. And then there's sort of big scale, right? So natural or human caused disasters like fires or floods or hurricanes. All of those can destroy digital storage infrastructure, resulting in potentially total loss of data, right? Especially if those are the only kinds of copies that are available. So the good thing is that there are strategies and practices and tools, people that can help, that can be utilized to limit, right, the potential loss specifically related to digital information and make it possible to ensure access and use over time. And really, perhaps the most significant factor is just recognizing, right, and sort of embracing that action needs to be taken now with digital information to ensure that future access to the valuable information your organization is producing, right? To ensure that at some point in the future, you'll continue to have access for those, particularly those really valuable resources. So I've already thrown out, right, a number of different words and terms so far. So I'd like to spend just a little bit of time on definitions now. So I think the title for this presentation could have potentially been, getting organized, the benefits and values of data management, or even knowledge management or records management. And I'm highlighting, those different terms to illustrate that there are many different kinds of terms that describe the different areas and aspects of the information ecosystem in organizations. And while there are, right, specific differences in concepts, definitions, and then the sort of strategies and tools and practices that you use, there are many sort of similarities and overlaps of these domains, and certain, right, industries or sectors or services may use specific terms to describe their practices, with the purpose of developing a shared vocabulary or standards or best practices that everybody can use. We could spend a long time going through the conceptual and philosophical debates around, the differences and similarities between data, information, records, and knowledge. But really, for our purposes today, I'd like to try and keep things simple. So there's a lot out there, but just for today, I want to use this sort of simple definition of information. So processed, organized, and structured data providing context for data and enabling decision-making processes. And I really think that last part, and enables decision-making processes, is perhaps the most helpful and useful part, because it really points to the value of information in how it can and will lead to change in organizations, right? It's not very useful just to have information that's been created or collected that's just sitting there, right? It's valuable because it's going to inform some sort of change in the organization. Something different is going to happen based on, what's been produced or what has been learned. And then here's a slightly longer definition of information management, about, the acquisition from one or more sources, custodianship or sort of taking care of it, managing it, the distribution of information to those who need it, right? So people have access, and then ultimately deciding whether it's going to be sort of kept longer term through archiving or sort of removed, disposed, or deleted. And I think even beyond this, a helpful way to think about information management is that it entails a proactive and an intentional approach, right, to the care and management of the various information resources your organization is creating or collecting. It's putting that intention into action by making determinations about what information is valuable to your organization, how it will be organized and described, and how long it will be kept, and then eventually, what sort of parts of it will be removed or deleted when they're no longer needed. So it's that sort of proactive intention rather than sort of not doing anything and then trying to come up with decisions later on in the future. So again, those previous definitions are somewhat helpful, but I think diving into the information lifecycle and seeing how it works in organizations will hopefully be more sort of useful and relevant. So organizations have missions, right? They have a purpose, their needs they're trying to meet, goals they're trying to accomplish, right? The communities they're serving, and the people in the various departments of a organization units they're doing the work, right? Whatever that work is, and on a regular basis in support of the organization's mission. And so those various processes, workflows, activities that are carried out on a regular basis, they likely look and feel differently in different types of organizations, but all along the way, right, information is being created. It's being gathered, it's used, it's shared, it's stored in different places. That's part of the work, right? The sort of generation and use of information. And so when we think about the basic life cycle, I tried to sort of illustrate this in this sort of circular pattern. So information is created, or it might be sort of collected and acquired. It's used in some way, right? It's analyzed, it's edited, it's combined. It might be shared or presented, internally or externally. It's stored, right? Sort of all along the way, right? Usually from the beginning. And then at some point, there's sort of a decision about what should happen with that information. Is it valuable enough to be sort of considered for inclusion in an archive, right? So whatever shape that takes, or is the usefulness of it come to an end and it can be deleted or disposed, right? It can be sort of removed in some way. And archives, right? That may just be some particular folder on the server, or it may be a specific, in larger organizations, right, a specific department that takes care of that, or even, maybe transfer to a totally different organization. So those can take different forms. And this is all to say that some of the information you're creating or gathering may only have value and be needed for a short amount of time, but other types may continue to have value into the future. And so information management is part about sort of being proactive and making those decisions and designations about different categories of information. So more on that in a bit. So I think to illustrate the information lifecycle further, I want to consider an example that's likely very familiar to many of you, the fundraising campaign. So whether you are engaging in sort of ongoing fundraising activity, or maybe at specific periods or moments of the year, right? Most nonprofits have workflows or processes in place related to seeking and securing needed funding to support programs, services, and operations. And right, each organization likely has their own way of doing fundraising. So for our purposes here, I'm going to briefly outline a series of steps that are really meant to be representative, right, of what could potentially happen during a fundraising campaign, but not meant to be totally comprehensive or prescriptive, and you likely do things differently. So, but as we walk through the steps, I'd like to encourage you to think about, what kinds of information might be produced, and what might be valuable going forward, and then we'll sort of talk through those. So, often at the beginning of a campaign, there might be a step of setting goals, setting campaign goals, right? So specific amounts of funding that you want to raise, numbers of members, right? If you're a membership organization, you want to recruit. Maybe there's particular kinds of audiences or communities you want to sort of reach out and make connections to. Again, these are all sort of things that might be included in goals. And next, if you, again, are looking at particular groups of people, particular kinds of donors, you might collect some information about them, figure out, what's important to them, what do they need, what are they interested in, and create something like a profile, right? Sort of descriptions that you could use. And then based on those, you could then move to, the specific campaign strategies, right? So the details of donor profiles, the specific goals, and you might come up with specific strategies like hosting a series of events, or maybe it's workshops or ways people can learn more about your organization. Maybe there'll be an online campaign of messages going out, or ways to engage with people on social media, or via email. So whatever strategies are sort of going to be implemented during the campaign. And then, based on a certain timeline, you'll start the campaign, you'll launch it, events will be hosted, messages are going to go out over, whatever time period you've designated. And during that period, you'll likely be sort of monitoring and collecting data, right, on engagement, potentially, whether that's just in-person events, right? How many people are coming? How are they involved? Did they ask questions? Or online strategies, right? If you're, again, looking at social media platforms, right, or other online platforms, there's ways of collecting and analyzing the sort of data, the analytics of those platforms. And then you get to the end, right? You're sort of wrapping things up, moving into the mode of looking at the strategies and evaluating those in relation to goals. And that might lead into producing some kind of report, right? A document that summarizes and distills the outcomes and the lessons learned from the campaign. So were goals met? What was the campaign impact? Those kinds of questions might be addressed. So at those various steps, right, there are likely multiple outputs, right, that are produced through the fundraising campaign process. And those outputs, likely have immediate value, right, in relationship just to the current campaign, right? Maybe you would sort of adjust your strategies, or maybe tweak your messages in different ways based on feedback, based on, level of engagement. But some of those outputs may also have value in the future, right? As you think about next year's fundraising campaign, or even, multiple years into the future, as you think about planning and sort of what you might shift or change going forward. So coming back again to the lifecycle model, you can imagine that those different outputs, the information resources created during the campaign, could be used in different ways, right? Or maybe they have value and should be kept for different amounts of time depending on your needs. So for instance, an organization might determine that the data that was collected about engagement during the campaign is really only useful to keep for about a year, right? And maybe it can inform next year's campaign, but beyond that, it's not helpful, right? To keep that around. You won't need to go back to it in the same way. But the reports, right, that sort of summary might be of greater value and could be, considered part of the archive, right, to keep over the long term. So now that we've seen, I hope I've done a reasonable job of illustrating a typical process, right, and an activity that produces multiple kinds of information in different forms. I want to spend a little more time thinking about, again, sort of why an organization will want to keep any of those outputs for any amount of time. And really this mode of determining what information is important, what has value and needs to be kept around, is really one of the first and most important steps in starting to get organized, right? Just deciding what to keep. And so I'd like to start with external mandates, right? The things sort of from the outside to consider. So all nonprofits operate within specific legal, fiscal, or regulatory frameworks. Sometimes there's specific guidance, right, on what kinds of documents or records need to be kept and maintained, but not always. So to stay in operation, right, an organization has to comply with these external requirements. And those often serve as sort of the basis for record keeping requirements. And there are resources available, right, to help with identifying those range of financial and administrative records that need to be maintained for legal, fiscal, and regulatory compliance. And at this point, I would definitely recommend checking out the recent forum on nonprofit finance basics, which provides an excellent overview of the kinds of particularly financial records, but also some administrative records and documents that nonprofits, right, need to be keeping, right, to be compliant with specific laws and regulations, right, for certain amounts of time. So I don't want to spend too much time going into some of those details, because I really think that beyond the types of information and documents that you need to keep, say, in case your organization is audited by the IRS, there's really less guidance on what other kinds of records or information an organization might consider valuable and worth keeping. But there really are a range of benefits that result from a systematic approach to managing information, which I'm going to go over, but they also help to outline even the types of information and documents and data that you could consider important for keeping and maintaining. So I'm going to move through these sort of internal needs, right, right now. So first off, thinking about maintaining institutional memory, right? And we talked about this a little bit earlier. So institutional memory is like the collective story, right, of where your organization started and how it has evolved and changed over time. And a lot of this information might be in people's heads, but much of it is also embedded in materials you've produced over time, right? So board governance documents, meeting minutes, other places where decisions have been documented, your annual reports, right? All of those kinds of documents. And keeping this kind of information organized and available is really key, right, to being able to add to and tell, right, new chapters, right, of your organizational story over time. There's also, the benefit of being able to document growth and change. It's hard to know, right, how you've made progress if you're not sure, right, where you started, right, sort of where you were at before. So documentation about past programs, activities, services, and how successful they've been, or maybe where things needed improvements, that's going to allow your organization to make the kind of smart, informed decisions about how to shift and change to new needs and priorities. Related, there's the ability, right, to measure impact and performance. So did you meet your recent fundraising goals? How effective were the different strategies you used? What new audiences and community members did you engage with, right? Being able to answer those kinds of questions, right? So collecting and analyzing sort of the data and the information about your programs can assist in measuring your performance in relationship, right, to your sort of higher level strategic goals, both in the short term, but also sort of going forward into the future. So information about those previous strategies and activities will also be a key resource when you're reviewing and reflecting and thinking about making plans for the future, and more on that a little later. So sometimes it can be challenging to illustrate how, right, various programs, your activities that are being carried out on a regular basis, how they connect, right, sort of connect up to the larger organizational mission. And those various small bits of information and data that are generated and collected they're like the multiple little small threads, right? When you sort of weave together, right, you have this sort of beautiful picture and tapestry of how the organizational mission is being achieved. So thinking about something like, a survey data, right? Showing the positive impact of your programs and services are having on members of communities, right? Seeing that as an example of sort of a small bit of information that can really demonstrate and support, show how the programs that you're implementing are directly tied and supporting the mission of the organization. So potentially worth keeping for some amount of time. And finally, there's the ability to demonstrate transparency and accountability. And in some ways, right, that's both an internal need and an external mandate, right, depending on different laws and regulations for different kinds of audiences and stakeholders. And yes, you need to maintain certain kinds of documents and records for legal reasons, but for many organizations, there's also an ethical motivation, right? To demonstrate transparency around internal processes, right? And how decisions are made to the communities they serve, right? The people they're trying to reach and impact. And so having a system in place where the information about those decisions is maintained, where it's made available, can really help with creating an environment of accountability throughout the organization and beyond. And so this list of sort of benefits, right? There's more. It's really intended to be a starting point. They're in certain types of organizations, right? There could be different kinds of benefits. But it might take sort of a shift in perspective and thinking to really embrace information management as an organizational activity, right? As part of what you do. And this is partly because, right, information and its flow and continued access is sort of assumed, and it's such a core part of organization activities that it can seem invisible, right? It can sort of seem like the circulatory system in our bodies, right? Sort of beneath the surface, it's flowing constantly to keep us functioning, but we're not really paying a lot of attention to it on a regular basis. We're sort of assuming it's all going to be fine. Information is also kind of like the glue, right? That binds different parts of your organization together. Various units, everyone's sort of impacted and touched in some way, but it's not always seen in sort of the same light or priority as, say, financial management or even the management of the people, right? Sort of human resources in the organization. And so I want to just sort of do a quick thought exercise. And what I have here is a list of resource categories that are available on the National Council of Nonprofits website. So if you go to their resource category section, it has, these various sections where you could, learn more and sort of get, helpful information about these various topics. And so they may not fully, this list may not fully represent all aspects, right, of what a given nonprofit do. I think they do provide a useful example of core functions and activities. And looking at this list, I'm wondering, like, could you imagine any of these categories where, having timely and easy access to, right, important information would not only be a basic need, but really key to organizational growth and success? So now that I've shared a bit about how information management can be valuable, right, how it can make a positive impact, I'd like to emphasize the connection between information management and planning for the future, right, of your organization. So I've used the words documentation, records, archives a few times so far, and those can tend to be associated with the past, right? Sort of activities and their sort of outputs, right, that have already happened. But information management is really key to planning for the future, right, of any organization. So organizing, maintaining, providing continued access to information helps to facilitate that connection between what you're doing now, your sort of current organization activities, and the future you're moving towards, right? The horizon you're trying to reach. And that manifests in, at least a couple different ways. So you think about, the information about how things work or the various again, workflows and processes and operations that take place on a regular basis. Those are all sort of valuable information assets themselves, right? For organizational growth and change and stability, right? So this kind of resource allows for a continuity of operations, right? When, for example, when new staff need to be trained, or when partnerships with other organizations are formed and you need to share information about, how you do things and how you're trying to collaborate together. But also in, more disruptive scenarios like emergencies or disaster events, having that information about processes, about how things work, can help organizations recover more quickly, sort of, get back to doing the work, when the time is right. In a similar vein, maintaining information so it can be easily summarized and presented can be very valuable in allowing for smoother transitions, right? So whether those are leadership changes or, organizational restructuring, right? Changing your organizational plan. These kinds of changes, right? They can be challenging, right? They can be difficult, but key information can provide a solid foundation and a connection, right? A way for the people in your organization to have common understanding, right? And be able to move through those kinds of changes together. So how do you go from seeing the value and a value of information, right? And recognizing the need to care for it, to actually organizing, managing, and maintaining information as a core part of what your organization does? So we're in the home stretch here. So as with, right, any kind of organizational change, and it is, some level of change, it's a process, right? It's one that happens at all levels, but can definitely benefit from an initial high level approach. And I'm now going to briefly outline some of those initial steps an organization can take to start proactively managing valuable information. So here they are, embedding management and information management into strategic planning, establishing basic policies, integrating information management into workflows, and selecting tools and systems to support the work. So I'll break down each of those. So very often, right, an organization's strategic plan outlines how it's going to evolve and change, right? Where it's going to make investments and improvements, and what it's going to let go of. So as I said before, right, information management can seem like sort of invisible infrastructure, right? The kinds of things that are needed to support the work of the organization, but not necessarily a goal or a priority that you would include in strategic planning. But I would encourage and really recommend that to truly embrace information management entails adopting a new kind of mindset, right? An approach and a way of working, a way to see information not just as the byproduct of the organization, but really as a strategic resource, right? To be valued and cared for now and going forward. And so to try to be seen on the same level as other kinds of strategic priorities, information management really needs to be included in an organization's strategic plan, right? In some way, shape, or form, along with the kinds of resources that are going to be needed to support staff at all levels, right? And transitioning to maybe new kinds of approaches or methods or tools that all sort of eventually result in valuable information being organized, managed, and maintained over time. And without this kind of high level embedding and codification, it could be easy, right, to sort of devalue and remove information management as a priority in the future, right? Sort of just put it to the wayside. A good next step, sort of from there, is establishing some high level policies, right? They don't need to be lengthy, but enough to get things started related to information management. So at their core, right, policies define commitments that an organization is going to make in relation to certain areas of governance and operations. So by developing and implementing policies on information management, an organization is communicating to both internal and external stakeholders that maintaining valuable information is a priority, right? And it's going to be focused on going forward. And those policies could take a few different forms, including something like, a records management policy, a document retention policy. And these policies, should include sections that start to define and categorize different types of valuable information assets, right? And how long they're going to be cared for. So again, going back to our fundraising campaign example, a retention policy would be where, right, decisions about how long certain documents, right, like campaign reports or even data resources should be kept, right? That's where those would be outlined. And this kind of policy would serve as a guideline for staff, as well as inform the selection and implementation of the systems, right, that are going to help with automating information management processes going forward. So that's not all just people doing it. So policies are going to help inform the kinds of steps and actions that should be built into the existing processes and workflows, to integrate them in, to ensure that the information that's being created and managed and maintained, so that those continue to be easily discoverable and shareable and available, right, for as long as they're needed. And this is likely to be sort of custom, right, particular to different organizations, because the goal is not really to radically change, right, or reinvent what you do, right, but rather start to build in, to integrate the kinds of information management actions into those workflows. And those could be things like, saving files in standard file formats, creating descriptive metadata or tagging files, right? Saving files, following specific file naming structures, right? So they're easier to understand and find later, all those sorts of things. And finally, to make information management activities sustainable and scalable, right, software systems and tools are going to be needed. And I imagine some of you might be thinking, like, can't we just get a software tool that's going to do all this information management work for us? Yes, software tools and services are going to make doing the work of information management easier, but they're only going to be useful if you've really established why they're needed, right, and how you're going to use them. And this is where and why those previous steps of building information management into strategic planning and establishing policies are really important. Those steps provide an opportunity for input and feedback from staff, right, as they sort of start to learn about them, on how incorporating information management is going to impact their activities and how it could actually work, as well as a foundation and a justification for spending resources, right, on software systems and tools. So having that clear understanding of what your needs and goals are is going to be really beneficial in determining what kinds of tools you need, right, as you start to sort of see what's available, to be able to start making caring for information a core and a regular part of what you do in your organization. So you might be wondering, again, how you're going to start tackling this alongside all of the other activities you're doing on a regular basis without hiring someone, right? Just getting someone on board to focus on just those tasks. So if you have resources, yes, having a dedicated person to help sort of lead and coordinate an information management strategy would be helpful. But right, many small and medium-sized organizations are likely not to have these kinds of resources, those kinds of resources. And a different approach, and one that I would actually really encourage and recommend, is a more distributed one, right? Where responsibilities for managing and caring for information become a part of what many different roles and positions in an organization do. So with this kind of approach, the management of information becomes a regular part of what staff do, a part of their ongoing workflows and activities. It will take a certain amount of upfront, right, sort of investment in time and resources and training, right, sort of learning some different ways of doing things, or again, maybe eventually using different kinds of systems and tools. So, even, external consultation or support might be needed for that sort of startup period, but ultimately, this will lead to a more solid and a sustainable foundation for an information management program. Something that, again, it's not based on just one person, but that is distributed across the organization. So sort of my last slide before closing. So I hope that I've either affirmed your belief and or sort of increased your understanding about why information is valuable, how information management can be beneficial in relation to almost all other organization activities. And there are potentially many detailed topics we could dive into, like creating taxonomies or how to select a digital asset management system. Ultimately, there needs to be a clear understanding of the need for and the value of embracing information management in your organization. And this understanding is likely to be different depending on your organization and where you're at, but hopefully I've piqued your interest and helped you imagine, right? Start to imagine how managing and caring for your information could lead to your organization being more efficient, being more organized, successful, and sustainable. So thank you again. Really, it's been my pleasure. I'm happy to answer any questions. I have some ways to get in touch here. Yeah, so happy to answer any questions that might have come up.
All right, thank you for that. Before we go any further, there is the slightest chance that in the beginning of this presentation, I may have mispronounced your name. So can you say your name for all of us so we can make sure we got it right?
Samuel Meister, but I go by Sam.
Okay, perfect. So we can find Samuel Meister, who can help us sort out our desktop on our computer, which is going to be my thing. I personally felt very attacked by the comments that you made around full inboxes, you know, unread emails. So
I should have shown my screen, email inbox screen.
We'll be talking about that after the forum.
Right on.
But in all seriousness, I know that this is a sort of thorn for a lot of organizations, but not one that's often discussed. So as we approach the Q&A section, go ahead and throw those questions into the Q&A box. I'll be looking to collect those from there. I know we have one starting out. Do you have a recommendation on what are effective tools and how to use them effectively? I actually have a follow-up question to this one, but we'll let you start out with that.
Yeah. Answering the question about tools is always tricky, right? Because it's sort of like you throw something out there and then people sort of grab that and they're like, oh, that must be the ultimate solution. And so I'm gonna have to start with it depends. And just to say that sometimes you are already using many tools, right? To create information, to use it, to share it, right? To sort of do all the work that you're doing. And so often it's not about like, oh, we need to go get this other thing, right? That's gonna solve all our problems. A lot of it is just thinking about how are we using our tools? Where are there maybe features or functions within those tools that we haven't used or we haven't explored or we just haven't sort of implemented it in ways, right, that can result in, you know, what you're creating being more discoverable and searchable and ultimately sort of continuing to be available going forward. So I'll just use Photoshop as an example, right? So if you're doing any kind of image editing, right, there's all the basic things you're going to do with image editing, but there's also features in Photoshop where you can add description, right, to the images that ends up being embedded in those files themselves. So the next time you open it up, you can sort of get to that information. You can talk about the people in those images or the dates or where it was, right? And that description can be used to sort of search for and find, you know, particular kinds of things later on. So if you want to tag something as like member appreciation event 2022, right? Then you can find all those images later. So as an example, but also within, web services, right? So your people might be using Google or, Microsoft Cloud resources. So I would say thinking about what are the features and functions that where you can sometimes even just implement rules, right? Sort of like rules or automated workflows, right? For how things should be saved, right? Sometimes you can do that so that when you're working with documents, the file names end up being automatically populated, right? Based on, again, how you've sort of set up the description. So those are good starting points. If ultimately, yes, you need a different kind of system, right? If you need to look at a document management system, right? Or a digital asset management system, because you're working with lots of images and videos, right? You need to be able to sort of have a specific portal, right? To sort of get to those particular kinds of assets, then even that is still a process, right? It's not always good to say like, oh, and here's the thing we should get because it's what's available. It's really about sort of thinking about, well, what is the volume and scale, right? What I don't want to go too far down the rabbit hole of like making choices about software, like software procurement, right? Because you got to think about like how many people are going to be using this at the same time and those kinds of things. But yeah, ultimately, I'd say think about what are you already using, where are there features and functions that can result in more sort of the outputs being more friendly, right, to being able to find and search and then continue to be available into the future. So I'll stop there.
That actually really got to the crux of one of my questions, because what I have found in our sector, and I'm sure this is true in other places as well, is that we have so many different types of information that need to be stored. Some are computer files, some are not computer files, some are like consumer data, some are HR data, some are, and folks want to find an enterprise-wide,
Right.
one-stop fits all kind of solution for all of their data needs. And I really loved what you said about digging into what you already have first to figure out how to maximize the use of that tool in order to, before you start expanding out and looking for, enterprise-wide, because usually it's, one-stop shop, but also not exactly perfect fit.
Yeah.
It can sometimes be really frustrating. So
Yeah.
balancing that is really important. We have a question about integrating systems. And I think this gets to what we're just discussing. If you have multiple different types of systems, how do you pull those together? What are some of the challenges and what are the solutions?
Right. Yeah, I think to sort of segue, a helpful way to think about tools and technology is, right, it's all going to be pretty short-lived, right? So even if you're using sort of the same tool, right, it's going to be updating, it's going to be changing, right? Some of those features and functions may change. So it's important to not stay too attached and sort of recognize that is going to be a sort of constant process of change, and thinking about integrating, right, or even just how you want your information assets, your data to be able to flow through systems. So if integration is ultimately about sort of flow and access, then one of those things might just be migrating, right? Sort of getting out of one system that is, right, not supported for whatever reasons, right? Either because your organization can't do it anymore, or because the company that was producing it went away. I mean, Microsoft's been around a long time, but just saying, sometimes there are lower cost solutions, right, that are maybe from smaller entities that are more sort of risky, that it might not be around. So when you're thinking about integration, there are some, system dependent things to keep in mind when you're looking at solutions, right? And part of that is, how easy when you're looking at it, when you're sort of investigating options you might want to consider, how easy is it to get your data out, like sort of to do one big dump export, right? And what are your options for formatting that, right? Is it going to spit out a bunch of individual files that you then have to deal with, or is it going to put that in a structured way? But ultimately, I think when you're thinking about an information management strategy and approach, it's helpful to think sort of system agnostic, right? And how can you best sort of position and structure your information within any kind of tool so that it allows for sort of either current integration or sort of future migration, right? So again, when you come down to like formats, right? How formats of if it's talking about files, or even how data is being structured, right? In certain kinds of, database backed systems. The cleaner, the cleaner the data is when it's going in, right? When it's sort of being created. So again, whether that's just, a photo database where you're, adding some description, where that's sort of, you're controlling, right? The kind of description. So you're saying that here are the way we're going to use dates, right? This is how we're going to write dates and for all of our different photos on different events. Then that's going to allow for those sort of standardized fields or formats to be more easily shared with a variety of different kinds of systems, right? When you can sort of map between different systems. Yeah, data governance was definitely one of the words I threw out there, and I think I would call that an emerging field, right? I mean, that term hasn't been around too long, and I think multinational corporations are still developing their data governance strategies. So thinking about what you need in a small to medium-sized organization, it may not translate in the same way. Again, you may not need the same kinds of systems. You may just need to think about your workflows and process as being part of that integration, right? So if you don't necessarily are in the sort of resource or capacity to be chaining a bunch of tools together, you can just think about, okay, well, what happens when we're done using this, and how do we move into these other systems? Even if it is sort of a hybrid manual situation, you can still sort of take advantage of what's already available.
What I feel like I hear you saying is harkening back a bit to the slide that you made around information management as a part of a strategic planning session, because the real rubber meets the road for you when you're planning in advance how you use your information together. So in what way does your information go from data points to ability to learn, to organizational knowledge, and what are the steps that it has to take to get there? And when you can map that out, it would be easier to figure out what systems might best suit you when you're trying to store that information. So that leads me to another question around succession planning. So you had mentioned the value of information management on succession planning, and also onboarding, so leadership onboarding. How can a leader that's planning to hand over the baton really start that preparation process for that new leader? And then how can a new leader pick up and run?
Right. Yeah, I could imagine that happening in some sort of informal or formal ways. So, right, just to be very low tech, right, there could be like the sheet of paper with like the top 10 things I learned during my time here, or something like that. But I think when you also get to the more formal steps, I think thinking about outlining the key resources, right? The key kinds of information resources that leader utilized on a regular basis, right? So, and it's not necessarily like a particular document, right? It could be like, certain kinds of data sources that are, sort of coming in on a regular basis. It's like, we do this annual survey of our members, right? And the summary of that is so valuable in making plans and decisions for the coming year's events or programs. So that is valuable. Even sort of a list of what has been determined to be the most valuable information assets, or sort of like vital records, right? Having those designated and codified so that a person coming in, right, can see very quickly, not only what that previous leader sort of saw valuable, but hopefully something that has been sort of translated across the organization, right? That it's something that is sort of leader independent, but that provides, helpful and useful information to that new leader coming in. So yeah, at a basis, and any sort of policy or anything like that would really start at defining those sort of core resources that need to be continued to be cared for over time.
Yeah, I think the list that you provided in your slides too, that came from the National Council of Nonprofits, is a really great place to start in succession planning, building that out and looking at what on each of those topics, what is your organization currently doing and how do we document those processes, and who has that information stored in their mind as opposed to documented anywhere? How do we get it from there onto very low tech wise, a piece of paper,
Right.
stuffed binder with little, dividers and stuff so that it can be literally handed over, or finding a more high tech solution for that. Speaking of high tech, we have a question regarding, let's see, it's a broad question around cloud-based data collection systems. Can you give us a primer of clouds and also tell us what are some things we should look out for when we're using a cloud, risks to data, and how do we mitigate those risks? And will that data be subject to being obsolete at some point, and how do we protect it?
Right. Yes. Cloud is still some physical devices somewhere. There, it's just there's lots of them, right, in these data centers. So the risks become less about the failure of physical media or obsolescence of the particular media devices, and it starts to get to be more to the nature or the terms of your contract, right? The sort of terms of agreement of the services being provided, right? And how much of that is sort of known and transparent and easy to digest, yeah, where there might be sort of unforeseen or unknown pain points. So, right, looking at a low cost cloud storage option, right, where it seems very cheap and you put your data in there, but then at some point in the future, it's your only copy, right? Because you had a local copy that disappeared, right? For maybe your external hard drive that you were using failed. And then you want to get that data out, and there's a really high cost, right, of just downloading, right? So getting a copy of that data back. So maybe you only need to find a couple files within there or something, but you have to download all of it. So when you're looking at these kinds of services, thinking about, how you might want to use that data that's being stored there in the future. Like, is it really a copy that's just in case of emergency, right? That it's only in the worst case scenario, and so the costs are sort of reasonable, right? Because that's what you need to spend. There's also, there starts to get to be other kinds of issues that are more related to sort of cultural heritage organizations that are sort of looking at data in a much more sort of detailed way and thinking about hundreds of years into the future. So it may not be as relevant necessarily for nonprofits. So I will say that, within those environments, they're going to have the core sort of IT functionalities on point, right? They're going to have security. They're gonna sort of be potentially encrypting your data, right, to really limit access. There could be issues with that if you're having to de-encrypt it on your side. But the basics are there. It's just a matter of looking at the details, right, of what those services provide and thinking about how that maps to what you actually need to be doing in relationship to that data. If you're looking for something where you're going to be constantly needing to access the data, right, because it's still in use, right, that's a sort of different kind of need, and there are different kinds of services, right, that you can look for. So if it's more production versus this is just like cold storage for the extra copies.
So, and to follow up on that, so it sounds like what you're saying is that the biggest point of difference between the cloud systems that a nonprofit organization might use are the terms of agreement that you agree to upon use of the system. And so paying close attention to what it takes to download your information off, what it takes to file it, where it's saved, what does a backup process look like, before you decide that that's the system for you. So the question in the Q&A box is around, so we can download cloud data and save it in physical data storage?
Sometimes. So I want to just like put out a disclaimer that I'm not like a cloud storage expert, right? Like I know quite a bit on how things work, but I don't want to like, what I'm saying is sort of come from experience, and I feel like it can be useful. But yes, often you can provide, or you can download sort of in bulk, right? Sort of get all of your data down at one time, right? Depending on your system and internet speed, that can take a while, or how much there is. You may be able to just get individual files, but it can depend, right? It can depend on the service, right? And how easy that is, because for the most part, right, for the last at least 20 years, if not, maybe the last 10 to 15, most IT shops, right, are moving away from maintaining local hardware, right, and like having something in the building, like the server in the building, to cloud-based services. So there may not even necessarily be an option to download and sort of store the total volume of the data that might be in a cloud service provider, because you just don't have the capacity locally, right? If you're just talking about your local device. If we're talking about, reasonably small amounts of data, terabytes, a few terabytes or something, then that's probably possible. But yeah, it's definitely a shift that's been happening, I think, across a variety of different sectors. So yeah, it could be possible. Again, those are things to investigate, right? And sort of make sure you have some sense of, if at some point you could foresee that scenario being needed.
So the next question I'm going to ask you might pull together a couple of questions in the question box. But if an organization were to have additional questions about this concept, they'd be able to reach out to you to kind of get those fleshed out, because we have some very specific questions in the question box.
Yes.
That you might be able to help folks get sorted. The other question I think that you've kind of answered, but we'll go back to, is suggestions on low-cost, easy storage systems for small organizations. You've mentioned using what you have as a start, but do you have anything else to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, it sort of depends on what you're using. Like if you're using Google, then you can buy storage in Google Cloud, right? Google data centers, right? For reasonably cheap. I mean, even if you're using something like Dropbox, those kinds of things, you get sort of, maybe it's like the business version of Dropbox, or you get sort of more storage for a cheaper rate. But yeah, there's an increasing amount of people who want to sell you cloud storage for pretty cheap. So even something like Backblaze, which does like automated backups, that's something that cultural heritage institutions are starting to use more, or something like Wasabi, which is, something you put on sushi, but also a cloud storage provider. So just a few things that, yeah, if you want to like do some searches and get a sense of some options that might work, yeah, those are a handful. But I am very happy to answer questions, to have conversations, to just sort of learn more about where people are at. And so you may not even have like a fully formed question, but I'm totally happy to have conversations. I love talking about this stuff, obviously.
All right, so that leaves us with one question, and that is thinking about this work broadly, including the components of strategy, investment, and talent. What types of talents or positions usually support this work? Where does it typically live within an organization?
Yeah, it's potentially, already an aspect of what certain people do, right? So if you have your digital content strategist, right, the person who's sort of doing a lot of sort of creating and producing things that are going out on your different platforms, right, for engagement, then I think being a part of the production process also just gives you the insight into, what's gone into the creation and what is valuable, right, and sort of how those might be used later on, right? So, I did this thing a while ago, I did this great publication, and now I want to pull pieces of that to like do something else, right? So those kinds of roles. Yeah, if you have somebody in an administrative position, right, that's already doing sort of some level of document management or records management, right, or sort of is doing the act of organizing, right, and thinking about what kinds of descriptors or tagging, things that are sort of relevant to the organization. I mean, those would be just a couple, right, a couple of the kinds of roles to think about leveraging, or at least sort of expanding. And it could be that there's someone who does something related to that in almost every department, right? Or you could sort of start to task or create a team, right? A sort of cross-functional team, right? To explore sort of how things are already working now, where there's overlap, where there's sort of commonalities, and then where you could sort of move to a more shared approach.
Yeah, I mean, I think I can speak to this a little bit as well. Previously in your presentation, you mentioned the importance of ownership across an organization of its own data management patterns. And that really does start at the strategy phase. And it would be difficult for one single person to have that conversation or own that work. It would really take folks from each corner of the organization who know their workflow and know their needs to come together and build out that strategy, and then go back to their corners to implement the strategy.
Right.
And so I'm not sure, I mean, organizations might have a CIO, or they might have an executive director who is all the people, or they might have, any various makeup. But the ownership of something like this really should be institution-wide, and that's how you get that good culture change that you were talking about around information management.
Yeah, and I think it's ultimately more resilient that way.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's really the crux of change management in general, is making sure that there's a good infiltration through the organization. So those are all the questions we have today, and it's also all the time we have today. So thank you very, very much for joining us today. You've offered to share your slides with those folks who have RSVP'd to this. So you will find Sam's contact information in his slide deck. If you have any further questions for him, please keep an eye out for your inbox for the slide deck, the recording of this, and the survey that we'd like you to fill out to tell us how we're doing with these forums. I also want to give a little reminder for our next month's financial statements, storytelling through financial statements. So keep an eye out for that. And Giving USA on June 23rd. So we are just excited for June. You've given us a great closeout for May. So thank you very much. And I wish everyone a wonderful afternoon.
Thank you all.